You think you know the man you married. You think after 3 decades of shared space and intertwined lives, he wouldn't have the nerve to hide something so audacious, so intimately humiliating. But here I am, staring down the truth, tasting the sharpness of betrayal that cuts deeper than I'd ever expected. My husband Ernest isn't the man I thought he was. In fact, he may never have been. The moment I found out about him and Sadie, a woman I'd once welcomed into our home as his good friend, my world collapsed inward. I could feel the memories rewriting themselves in my mind, scenes from our shared life shifting, distorting, as I saw them for what they truly were, lies, crafted to keep me comfortably in the dark. What came next, though? That was all me. I realized I had a choice, but not the kind you'd expect. Leaving would have been too easy, too quick. Instead, I decided to stay and unravel the web they'd so meticulously woven. A smile touched my lips as I remembered an old friend from my past, someone Ernest would never have seen coming. Someone who'd be more than willing to help me turn this betrayal into something unforgettable. I started noticing the signs about a year ago, though I'd brushed them aside as unimportant, the way we often do with little things that prick at the edges of our minds. It began with the late nights he spent at the office, the whispered phone calls he'd brush off as clients who were in a tight spot. I'd been married to Ernest long enough to know when he was lying. A man who can argue cases in court as coolly as he can't pull off a convincing lie at home. His tells were small, but to me, they were glaring. The way he'd hesitate just a little too long, or how he'd glance at the door whenever his phone buzzed. One Friday night, Ernest claimed he had to wrap up some work. I said nothing but made a mental note. After he left, I followed him, trailing his car all the way to a small, discreet hotel on the edge of town. And there she was, Sadie, waiting for him at the entrance. They embraced quickly, their faces brushing in an intimacy that left little to the imagination. The sight of them together left me breathless, like I'd taken a physical blow. I barely remembered driving home, but once I did, the weight of the betrayal pressed down hard, suffocating. For days I wandered through our house like a ghost, replaying memories, questioning everything he'd ever said and done. Was this affair just another passing indulgence, or had it been going on for years? There was only one thing I knew for certain: I wanted them to pay. But how? After the initial sting subsided, I began to plot. I'd make Ernest regret ever underestimating me. But I'd need help, and I knew just the person. Calvin "Cal" Murphy, my old college flame, had always been clever. Almost too clever, really. He was the type who never let things go, a trait that had once made him obsessive in his journalism career. A quick search online showed me that he was back in town, just a few hours away. I wasn't sure if he'd agree to this twisted idea I had in mind, but there was only one way to find out. I contacted Cal under the pretense of wanting to catch up, like an old friend nostalgic for the past. We met at a cozy little cafe on the edge of town, one I knew Ernest would never stumble upon. Seeing him again was strange at first, like looking at a half-forgotten photograph. The years had softened him, adding creases around his eyes, but the sharp intellect I remembered still glinted behind his gaze. "What brings you to me, Iris?" he asked, giving me a shrewd look over the rim of his coffee cup. "Maybe I just wanted to see an old friend," I said with a small smile, deflecting. But when he kept looking, I knew he could see the truth. I leaned in, lowering my voice, the words slipping out almost before I knew what I was saying. "It's Ernest. He's having an affair. With Sadie Collins." The shift in his expression was subtle, but I could tell he was intrigued. "And you want my help, don't you?" "Not just help," I said, feeling a thrill as I shared my plan. "I want to make them pay." The spark that lit in Cal's eyes was unmistakable. He was hooked. Ernest had always been clever with words. He knew how to present just enough of the truth to make a lie plausible, the way he did with clients. But there's a subtle difference between a man who's merely distracted and one hiding something dark. Ernest's late nights, the hushed conversations, the way he pulled back when I reached for his hand at dinner. It was all there in hindsight. But back then, I'd chosen to ignore it. On the night I followed him to that hotel, I almost turned back. It was uncharacteristic of me, sneaking around. But some unexplainable force compelled me, a desperate need to know the truth. When I saw Sadie's slender figure waiting at the hotel entrance, her head tilted toward Ernest in that familiar, intimate way, everything clicked into place. They didn't even notice me. I watched them, unable to look away, as they embraced under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. He held her so naturally, without hesitation, the way he'd once held me. The days following were a blur of shock and numbness. Every detail, every smile, and every shared moment played back in my mind as I questioned. How long had this been going on? Was I the only one who hadn't seen it? And the most agonizing question of all? Why? The anger came later, a slow burn that replaced the ache of betrayal. For years, I'd played the role of the supportive wife, standing by Ernest as he climbed the ladder in his firm. I'd celebrated his victories, downplayed his failures, and smoothed over every rough edge. I'd been his anchor, his partner, the one person who truly understood him. Or so I thought. Now, every word of praise, every whispered promise felt like a bitter joke. I could have confronted him. I could have screamed, accused, demanded answers. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, a refusal to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Maybe it was the realization that he'd see it as his triumph, his liberation. He'd get to be the man who'd outsmarted me, and that I couldn't allow. In those dark moments, my mind drifted back to Cal Murphy. It had been decades since I'd last seen him. We'd parted ways on a friendly note, but there was something left unfinished, an unspoken bond that lingered. Cal had always been intense, with a knack for unraveling secrets. If there was anyone who could help me make sense of the chaos, it was him. With a few clicks, I found him. A widower, living alone, working as a freelance journalist. I hesitated, the cursor hovering over the send message button. Then, without overthinking, I pressed it. Cal's reply came faster than I'd expected. A simple line. Iris Kincaid? Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Coffee tomorrow? We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Cal looked different. Gray streaked his hair. His face was more lined, but his gaze was just as piercing. He watched me intently, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd expected me to reach out all along. Iris, he greeted, his voice warm and familiar. It's been too long. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up on the trivialities of life, the jobs we'd had, the cities we'd lived in, the people we'd known. But he sensed there was more, something deeper beneath my practiced smile. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. So, what's the real reason you wanted to meet? He asked, his tone gentle but probing. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling to a photo I'd taken of Ernest and Sadie outside the hotel. I handed it to him, my hands steady, my heart hammering. Cal studied the photo, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak for a long moment. So, he finally said, setting the phone down. What are you going to do about it? Not what you'd expect, I replied, a faint edge to my voice. I didn't need pity. I didn't need sympathy. I needed someone who understood the bitter satisfaction of taking control. Cal looked at me with a new intensity, a glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. You want to make them pay? Yes, I said, feeling a thrill as the words left my lips, but I can't do it alone. Cal was surprisingly open to my proposal, perhaps too open. It seemed he was not only intrigued by the idea of helping me, but eager to dive into the murky waters of revenge. He listened as I outlined my thoughts, nodding along, occasionally adding a suggestion or two. Together we began to sketch out a plan, a careful, calculated sequence of events, designed to disrupt, manipulate, and ultimately destroy the trust between Ernest and Sadie. Cal had a flair for this. He proposed we start subtly, planting seeds of doubt and mistrust that would eat away at their relationship from the inside. An anonymous message here, a misleading hint there. His experience as a journalist served him well. He knew how to build a story, how to shape a narrative. And this time, the narrative would be one of betrayal, suspicion, and inevitable ruin. I found myself captivated by Cal's intensity, his willingness to dive headlong into the plan. As he spoke, I felt a spark, a long-dormant part of me coming to life. There was something thrilling, almost seductive, about taking control, about crafting a plan with precision and care. I had spent years being the supportive, accommodating wife. Now, I was ready to be something else entirely. Our first move was simple but effective. Cal drafted an anonymous letter, typed meticulously on an old typewriter he'd kept for years. The letter hinted at secrets, at unseen betrayals. It was vague, designed to sow doubt without revealing specifics. We knew Ernest's mind well enough to predict how he'd react. He'd become suspicious, alert, always looking for cracks in Sadie's story. We sent the letter, addressed to him at his office. Then, we waited. A week passed before I saw any sign of a shift. One evening, as Ernest and I sat across from each other at dinner, I noticed a certain tension in his posture, a distracted look in his eyes. He was listening, but not to me. His gaze kept drifting, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. "What's on your mind?" I asked, feigning innocence. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing important." I could tell he was lying, and it brought a dark satisfaction I hadn't expected. Here he was, the man who'd betrayed me, now plagued by the same doubts, the same gnawing fear. I could see the beginnings of paranoia in his eyes, the way he'd glance at his phone, the slight jump whenever it vibrated. In the days that followed, his behavior became more erratic. He'd leave in the middle of the night, claiming he needed some air, or he'd disappear into his office, the door firmly closed. I watched him unravel, and with each passing day, the satisfaction grew. But this was only the beginning. With Ernest beginning to show signs of paranoia, Cal and I moved on to the next stage. Cal, ever resourceful, had access to certain databases that most people wouldn't even know existed. We pored over records, financial documents, and any scraps of information we could find about Sadie's past. It felt surreal, as though I'd slipped into some clandestine underworld, far removed from the ordered life I'd once known. But there was something darkly satisfying in it. "Here," Cal said one evening, pointing to his laptop screen. "This might be useful." I leaned in, reading the document closely. Sadie had, years ago, been involved in a legal dispute over finances with a former employer. There were whispers of embezzlement, though she'd never been formally charged. I felt a flicker of excitement. This was exactly the kind of skeleton that could shatter the carefully curated persona Sadie had shown Ernest. "That's perfect," I whispered, barely containing my excitement. "We'll need to be careful with how we use it," Cal warned. "Too direct, and they'll know it's a setup. But if we drop hints in the right places..." His voice trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. We didn't need to say more. We both understood how this would play out. The next day, I made an anonymous call to Ernest's office, using a voice modulator Cal had given me to disguise my tone. "I think you should know that your friend has a complicated past," I said, keeping my voice low and hushed, as though I were a friend passing along sensitive information. "Look up the Baxter Corporation embezzlement case." I hung up before he could ask questions, my heart racing as I imagined him digging into the information. I pictured his face contorting with disbelief and suspicion as he uncovered Sadie's hidden history. It wasn't long before I saw the effects. Ernest grew distant, his usual confidence dimmed. There was a tenseness to him, a flicker of distrust in his gaze whenever Sadie's name came up. One night, I noticed him scrolling on his laptop, the screen casting an eerie glow over his face as he read, his brow furrowed. "You're up late," I commented casually, feigning sleepiness as I peered over his shoulder. He closed the laptop abruptly. "Just catching up on some things," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. I felt a surge of satisfaction. Here was a man so consumed by his own secrets, he couldn't even face his wife anymore. It wasn't long before I crossed paths with Sadie herself. I hadn't planned on it, but the sight of her alone at the local grocery store, studying a row of wine bottles, was too tempting to ignore. I approached her, adopting my warmest, most innocent smile. "Sadie, it's been too long," I said, infusing my voice with a friendly cheerfulness that took her off guard. She looked up, her smile faltering for a split second before she recovered. "Iris, yes, it has been a while. How are things?" "Oh, same old," I replied, picking up a bottle of wine and examining the label absently. "Ernest has been a little distracted lately, though. Work, I suppose, you know how it is." Her eyes flickered with something, guilt perhaps, or maybe fear. I watched her, noting the subtle shifts in her expression. It was the look of someone hiding something, and she knew I could see it. "Anyway," I continued, lowering my voice slightly, "he's been mentioning you a lot lately. I think he's been worried about you." Sadie's face paled. She attempted to smile, but the tension in her eyes betrayed her. "Oh, that's, very kind of him, but I'm fine. Really." I leaned closer, dropping the mask of cheerfulness for a moment. "You're sure? I wouldn't want anything unfortunate to happen." "No, Ernest does hate surprises." With that, I left her, enjoying the unsettled look she wore as she watched me walk away. Cal and I had been spending an increasing amount of time together. Our meetings, which had started as practical discussions about our plan, had become something else entirely. I found myself looking forward to our late-night talks, the laughter, the shared glances. There was something comforting in his presence, a reminder of a time when life had been simpler. One evening, as we sat in his dimly lit apartment, sipping wine and discussing the latest developments, he suddenly reached over, placing his hand on mine. "Iris," he began, his voice soft and serious, "I never told you this back then, but I always had feelings for you, even when we were just friends." I felt my pulse quicken, a warmth spreading through me that I hadn't felt in years. There was an honesty in his gaze that made me feel seen, truly seen, in a way Ernest never had. I don't know what to say," I murmured, caught between surprise and an unexpected thrill. "This is complicated." "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." We lingered in that moment, a breath away from something that would change everything. In the end, I didn't pull away. The line between revenge and something more personal had blurred, and I was no longer certain where one began and the other ended. Days turned into weeks, and our plan continued to unfold, each new twist adding a layer of complexity. Ernest and Sadie grew more distant, their conversations tinged with suspicion and frustration. I watched from the sidelines, savoring every tense exchange, every look of doubt that passed between them. But as much as I enjoyed the unraveling, I couldn't shake the growing tension between Cal and me. Our relationship had shifted, and it was becoming harder to ignore. One evening, as Cal and I reviewed our next steps, he leaned back, a frown creasing his forehead. "We need to be careful, Iris," he warned. "Things are getting messy." "What do you mean?" I asked, surprised by his sudden hesitation. "We're playing with fire here," he said, his gaze intense. "And it's not just Ernest and Sadie who could get burned. We could be risking everything." I brushed off his concern with a forced smile. "Isn't that what makes it exciting?" But in the back of my mind, a seed of doubt had taken root. For the first time, I wondered if we'd gone too far. Yet I was in too deep to turn back. The thrill of revenge had become an addiction, and I was powerless to resist its pull. Ernest had always been a man of control, someone who wore authority like a second skin. But now, That armor was cracking. The late-night phone calls, the anonymous messages, and the unexpected hints about Sadie's past had left him visibly shaken. He barely looked me in the eye anymore, his expression one of constant suspicion and frustration. I could feel the tension building, a crackling energy in our home that kept me both on edge and exhilarated. One evening, Ernest confronted me, his voice laced with irritation. "Have you been talking to anyone about us?" he asked abruptly, his eyes narrowed. I feigned confusion. "What are you talking about?" He looked away, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "Never mind," he muttered, as if realizing he'd overstepped. But I could tell that the doubts were eating away at him. Just as I'd planned. That night, I watched him from across the dinner table, feeling a sense of satisfaction as he brooded, his mind likely racing with questions. He was beginning to unravel, and for the first time he was experiencing the helplessness I'd felt the moment I discovered his betrayal. A few days later, I noticed a man outside our house. He stood by the curb, a nondescript figure in a dark coat, leaning casually against his car. At first, I thought he was a passerby, someone waiting for a friend. But the way he looked at our house, watchful, calculating, sent a prickle of unease down my spine. Later that evening, I mentioned it to Cal. "I think Ernest hired a private investigator," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Cal's expression darkened. "That complicates things," he replied, his tone sharper than usual. "If he's looking into you, into us, we need to be more careful." I could tell that Cal was more concerned than he was letting on. His gaze lingered on me, a mixture of protectiveness and unease. I realized that, in his own way, he was invested in this revenge almost as much as I was. But there was something else in his eyes, something that hinted at a deeper fear. "What are you thinking?" I asked, searching his face. Cal hesitated, then took my hand. "Iris, we can't afford any mistakes now. If this investigator digs too deep, it could all fall apart." His words sent a chill through me, but I forced a smile, refusing to let fear take hold. We'd come too far to back down now. With each passing day, the stress was taking its toll on Sadie. Her once confident demeanor was eroding, replaced by a fragile, jittery woman who barely resembled the polished friend I once knew. She'd started missing work, claiming personal reasons that Ernest couldn't ignore. One afternoon, I happened to see her at a nearby cafe, sitting alone at a corner table. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged, her eyes red-rimmed as she stirred her coffee absently. I couldn't resist. I walked over, putting on my warmest smile. "Sadie," I greeted her, pretending to be surprised. "Are you all right?" Her gaze snapped up to meet mine, a flash of panic in her eyes. "Oh, Iris, I didn't see you there." She was clearly on edge, her hands trembling as she set her coffee down. I could feel her anxiety, her guilt simmering just beneath the surface. The sight was strangely satisfying, a vindication of everything she'd put me through. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "I heard about what's been happening with Ernest. Are you sure you're safe?" Her face went pale, and she looked away, the shame and fear etched deeply into her expression. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I knew she understood. She was cracking under the weight of her own deception, and I had no intention of stopping until her carefully constructed life crumbled completely. As Sadie's world began to collapse, so did the barrier between Cal and me. We were no longer simply partners in revenge. Our meetings grew more intimate, each moment filled with an unspoken tension that neither of us could deny. The thrill of our plan had ignited something between us, a spark that was hard to ignore. One evening, as we sat in his apartment, Cal reached for my hand, holding it gently as he looked into my eyes. "Iris, I know this has been about getting back at Ernest, but..." His words trailed off, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. There was something he wanted to say, something that went beyond the revenge we'd planned together. For a moment, I felt a pang of uncertainty. I hadn't anticipated the depth of his feelings, nor the impact they'd have on me. Cal? I whispered, feeling my own emotions stirring. I didn't expect this. Neither of us moved, the air thick with the weight of what we weren't saying. In that moment, I realized that Cal was no longer just an ally in this twisted game. He'd become something more. Someone who made me feel alive in a way Ernest never had. But even as the connection deepened, a part of me knew that this was dangerous. We were bound by shared secrets and mutual desires. But if our plan failed, we'd both lose everything. As the investigator's presence lingered, I began to grow more anxious. I saw him more frequently now, watching our house from a distance, making notes, occasionally speaking into his phone. I knew it was only a matter of time before he'd uncover something that would expose our plan. One evening, Ernest confronted me in the kitchen, his face tense and his eyes filled with accusation. He held up a series of anonymous notes, the ones Cal and I had carefully crafted to chip away at his confidence. "Care to explain these, Iris?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. I feigned confusion, putting on my best act. "What are you talking about? Why would I know anything about those?" But he wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his gaze fierce, a shadow of the man I'd once known. "You think I don't see what's happening? You're trying to destroy me. You've been planting these seeds, haven't you?" I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my composure, meeting his gaze steadily. "Why would I do that, Ernest? If anyone's guilty here, it's you," he scoffed, his expression twisting into one of bitter resentment. "You think you're clever, don't you? Playing the innocent wife while you're out there plotting with whoever's helping you." The accusation stung, but I held my ground, refusing to let him see my fear. "You have no proof," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You can accuse me all you want, but it won't change what you did. You brought this on yourself." With that, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen, his anger simmering beneath the surface. I knew this was a turning point, that the facade we'd both worn was beginning to crumble. But I didn't care. I'd come too far to back down now. It was late one evening when I noticed the investigator again, his car parked discreetly across the street, a silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was closing in. His presence had become more frequent, his watchfulness a constant reminder that our plan wasn't as hidden as I'd hoped. The next morning, Ernest confronted me, his face shadowed with an intensity I hadn't seen before. He held up a printed page, his knuckles white with anger. "Why are there anonymous bank deposits showing up in our account?" he demanded. I stared at the paper, recognizing Cal's subtle contributions. It was money we'd used to fund our setup, the anonymous tips, the investigators' distraction tactics, small payments made to mislead Sadie. It seemed Cal's meticulous planning had one flaw: the small, traceable deposits that had inadvertently linked back to us. Feigning innocence, I shook my head. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ernest." He took a step closer, his face inches from mine. "This isn't just some game, Iris. I know something's going on here. You've been hiding things, and I'm done playing along." His words struck me cold. It was as if he'd finally shed the mask, revealing a part of himself I'd never seen, or perhaps never wanted to see. Later that night, I met with Cal at our usual spot. I could tell from his expression that he already knew about the investigator's breakthrough, and a shadow of doubt lingered in his gaze. "We might have to pull back," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "If he's finding links to us." "No," I interrupted, my voice sharper than intended. "We've come too far to turn back now." Cal sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Iris, this isn't just about revenge anymore. We're both at risk. Maybe it's time to end this before it goes any further." There was a pause, a moment where his words hung heavy between us. For the first time, I felt a flicker of resentment toward him. He'd been there from the start, fueling the fire, encouraging every twist and turn. And now he was having second thoughts. What happened to the Cal who was willing to take risks? I challenged, my voice low. The one who said he'd stand by me no matter what. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw a hint of fear. This isn't just a game, Iris. This could ruin us both. But I couldn't stop. Not now. The taste of control, the thrill of watching Ernest unravel, was intoxicating, and I was in too deep to abandon it all. The following day, I received an unexpected call from one of Sadie's close friends. Her voice was tense, anxious. Iris, I'm not sure if you've heard, but Sadie, she's been admitted to a hospital. A breakdown, they said. She's been under so much pressure lately, and well, I thought you should know. The news struck me like a physical blow. I hadn't intended for this. I wanted to unsettle her, to let her feel the same insecurity and betrayal that she'd brought into my life. But I hadn't expected her to break. Later, as I sat alone in the quiet of our living room, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease. This wasn't what I'd envisioned, but I couldn't deny the power it had given me, the sense that I'd finally reclaimed control over my life. Yet a part of me felt a hollow pang, a realization that I was losing sight of the woman I once was. The days passed in tense silence. Ernest, now more paranoid than ever, became increasingly erratic. He began spending nights away, muttering about taking care of things, but I knew he was hiding, retreating from the mess his life had become. One evening he returned home, his face drawn, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. You think you're clever, don't you, Iris? Playing the victim while you pull all the strings? I feigned innocence, but he saw through it, his gaze piercing. I know you're behind this, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how you've done it, but I'll find out. And when I do. He didn't finish, but the threat lingered in the air. For the first time, I felt a chill of fear, a realization that Ernest was willing to do whatever it took to regain control. This was no longer a game. It was a battle, and we were both willing to fight to the bitter end. The tension between Cal and me had been simmering, our relationship strained under the weight of what we'd set in motion. He'd grown distant, less willing to meet, his gaze shadowed with doubt. It felt as though our bond, the trust and companionship that had fueled our revenge, was slipping away. One evening he met me with an unfamiliar expression, a look of guilt and something else I couldn't place. Iris, he began, his tone hesitant. I don't know if I can keep doing this. The word struck me cold. What are you saying, Cal? He looked away, avoiding my gaze. This has gone too far. Sadie's in the hospital, and Ernest? He's desperate. This isn't just revenge anymore. It's a betrayal, I finished, my voice thick with bitterness. Don't you dare back out now. We had a plan, Cal. But his silence told me everything. I realized then that I'd lost him, that the man who had once stood by me was now faltering, unwilling to follow me down the path we'd chosen together. In that moment, I understood that I was alone. I had no allies left, no one I could trust. Cal had betrayed me, and Ernest... Well, Ernest would stop at nothing to expose my role in this. That night I returned home to find Ernest waiting, his expression a mixture of triumph and fury. He held a file in his hands, the investigator's final report, proof of everything Cal and I had orchestrated. You thought you could ruin me? He snarled, his voice laced with contempt. You thought I wouldn't find out? For a moment I felt a surge of panic, a realization that I'd underestimated him. But then a cold calm settled over me. I'd known this moment would come, that there would be a reckoning, and I was ready. I met his gaze, unflinching. Yes, I did. And I'd do it again. His face twisted with rage, his hands clenching around the file. You think you've won, don't you? I don't need to win, I replied, my voice steady. I just needed you to feel what it's like to lose everything. In the silence that followed, I saw the realization dawn in his eyes, the understanding that he'd lost control, that his carefully constructed life had been shattered by his own betrayal. Without another word, he left, the door slamming shut behind him. I was alone, the silence heavy. the consequences of my actions settling around me like a shroud. After Ernest's departure, the house felt emptier than it had in years. I wandered through the rooms, each corner a reminder of the life we'd once shared. There were photographs on the walls, vacations, anniversaries, birthdays, moments frozen in time, untouched by the betrayal that had silently unraveled everything beneath the surface. In those photos, we looked so happy. But now, they seemed like ghosts, relics of a life that no longer existed. In the quiet that followed, I felt a hollow ache. I had won, hadn't I? Ernest's life was in shambles, Sadie had crumbled under the weight of her own choices, and Cal had shown me his true colors, proving that loyalty is as fragile as love. But was it worth it? I poured myself a glass of wine, letting the silence settle around me. I'd spent so long crafting this plan, meticulously orchestrating every detail, and now that it was over, I felt unmoored, as though the very purpose that had driven me was gone. In chasing revenge, I'd destroyed everything. And in the process, I'd lost myself. A few days later, Cal showed up at my doorstep. He looked weary, a shadow of the man he'd been when we first reunited. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of regret and something else I couldn't quite place. "Iris," he began, his voice quiet. "I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have backed out like that. I wasn't prepared for everything." I stared at him, feeling a surge of anger mixed with a strange sense of relief. He'd come to apologize, to make amends. But was there anything left to salvage? "Apologies don't mean much now, do they?" I replied, my tone sharp. "We've both done things we can't undo." He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I thought revenge would be simple. I thought it would feel satisfying. But all I feel now is regret." A bitter laugh escaped me. "Regret? You have the luxury of walking away, Cal. You get to go back to your life, but I have to live with the consequences." He didn't answer, and for a moment, we stood there in silence. Two people bound by shared guilt and bitterness. I realized then that Cal had been a vessel for my anger, a way for me to project my own pain onto someone else. But now there was nothing left to hold us together. Without another word, I closed the door, shutting him out for good. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, but as soon as I opened it, I knew it was from Ernest. "Iris, you wanted to see me suffer, and you succeeded. Everything I built, every relationship I valued is gone. You took it all from me. I don't know if you'll find any satisfaction in this, but I hope you do. Because in the end, I've realized that none of it matters. We spend our lives building things that can be torn down in a moment by the people we trust most. Enjoy your victory. It's yours now. E." I sat down, reading the letter over and over. It was as close to an admission of defeat as Ernest would ever give. And yet, instead of the satisfaction I'd once craved, all I felt was a hollow emptiness. He was right. I had won. But in doing so, I destroyed the very life I'd once fought so hard to protect. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to the memories of who I once was. There were moments when I remembered the woman who'd married Ernest, the young, hopeful bride who believed in promises and shared dreams. She felt like a stranger now, someone I barely recognized. I thought of Sadie, of the guilt and shame she must have felt in those final days before her breakdown. I wondered if she'd ever thought of me, if she'd ever felt remorse. But in the end, it didn't matter. Sadie was gone, her life irrevocably changed, and the woman I'd once called a friend was nothing more than a shadow in my mind. And Cal, my old friend, my once ally, had faded into the background, his presence nothing more than a reminder of the lengths I'd gone to for revenge. I'd thought of him as my partner in this, a man who shared my anger, my desire to see justice served. But now I realized that Cal had been as lost as I was, and that in the end, we'd both been chasing something that could never truly heal us. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I found myself reflecting on the choices I'd made, The anger that had driven me, the need for control, the desire to see Ernest suffer. All of it had consumed me, turning me into someone I barely recognized. And now, I was left with the ruins of a life I'd once cherished. A life that I had willingly destroyed. In a final act of closure, I gathered up the photographs, the mementos of our life together, and placed them in a box. I took one last look at the images, the frozen smiles and shared moments before sealing it shut. It was time to let go, to release the memories that had bound me to a life that no longer existed. As I closed the box, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet acceptance of what I'd done. I'd sought revenge, and I'd won. But in doing so, I discovered that victory comes at a cost, one that I'd pay for the rest of my life. Months passed, and gradually I began to rebuild. I found a new place to live, a smaller, simpler space that didn't carry the weight of the past. I began to reconnect with old friends, people who hadn't been touched by the chaos of my revenge. It was a slow process, a tentative step toward a new life. There were moments when the memories returned, fleeting images of Ernest, Sadie, and Cal, reminders of the choices I'd made. But I let them pass, allowing myself to move forward without being weighed down by regret. In the end, I realized that revenge had been a lesson, a dark journey that had shown me the depths of my own anger, my capacity for destruction. But it had also taught me the importance of letting go, of finding peace within myself instead of seeking it in the downfall of others. And as I walked forward into the unknown, I felt a quiet strength, a knowledge that, though I had lost much, I had gained something more valuable. I had reclaimed myself. It wasn't until I saw his face that I realized what I had done. I'd forgotten to lock the door. And now, Ethan was standing there, his eyes wide, frozen in place as if he couldn't decide whether to look away or apologize. I wasn't trying to tempt fate. It was just another busy afternoon, one of those days where you get so caught up in the little things that you forget the simplest details. Mark was out of town again, and Ethan had mentioned he'd be at the library all day. I thought I had the house to myself, so I didn't think twice about leaving the bedroom door unlocked as I changed clothes. I'd been trying on dresses for a dinner party I wasn't even sure I wanted to attend. One by one, I discarded them, piling them on the bed as I searched for something that made me feel like myself again. It had been a long time since I'd felt seen. Mark barely noticed me anymore, and I was starting to wonder if I even noticed myself. I was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the straps of a fitted black dress, when the door creaked open. At first, I didn't register what was happening. But when I turned, I saw Ethan standing there, his hand still on the doorknob. His expression a mix of surprise and something else. Something that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His face flushed immediately, and he started to back away. "I'm sorry," he stammered. I thought you were downstairs." I grabbed a robe, fumbling to cover myself as I tried to process what had just happened. "It's okay," I said quickly, though my heart was pounding. "I should have locked the door." He nodded, his gaze darting between me and the floor. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," I interrupted, more forcefully this time. "Really, it's fine." He hesitated for a moment before retreating, closing the door behind him. I stood there, staring at the closed door, my mind racing. The look on his face, the way his eyes had lingered just a second too long, stayed with me, no matter how much I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was nothing. An awkward moment we'd both forget by the next day. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted between us in that brief, unguarded moment, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the spark that had been lit. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. I just didn't know it yet. After the door closed, I stayed frozen in place, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My cheeks were flushed, my pulse racing. I'd never felt so exposed. And yet there was something about the way Ethan had looked at me that lingered in my mind. It wasn't just surprise or embarrassment. There was something deeper, something I didn't want to name. I threw on the robe I'd grabbed and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to collect my thoughts. It was nothing, I told myself, just an awkward accident. But the truth was, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The way his eyes had widened, the way his breath hitched, it was burned into my memory. And worse, the way my body had reacted to his gaze left me feeling both ashamed and exhilarated. The next morning, I did my best to act normal. I went about my routine as if nothing had happened, hoping Ethan had already forgotten the incident. But when I came downstairs, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. He glanced up when I walked in, and our eyes met for the briefest moment before he looked away. "Good morning," I said, keeping my tone light. "Morning," he replied, his voice tight. I could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. He was fidgeting with his mug, his eyes fixed on the table, as if he couldn't bring himself to look at me. I wanted to say something, to clear the air, but I didn't know how. What could I even say? That it didn't mean anything? That we could just forget about it and move on? I wasn't even sure I believed that myself. Instead, I busied myself with making coffee, keeping my back to him. But I was hyper-aware of his presence, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor when he stood up. He muttered something about heading out for the day, and before I could respond, he was gone. Over the next few days, things only got more complicated. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was stilted and awkward. Every time we were in the same room, I could feel his eyes on me, though he was careful not to let me catch him staring. And when I did glance his way, the look on his face made my stomach twist, like he was battling something inside himself. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into things. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. It seeped into every interaction, every shared moment. I found myself avoiding him, taking extra precautions to make sure I didn't leave my bedroom door unlocked again. But even then, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way he'd looked at me that day, the way his presence seemed to linger in my mind no matter how hard I tried to push it away. One night, I couldn't sleep. Mark was out of town again, and the house felt too quiet, too still. I went downstairs to get a glass of water, hoping it would help calm my restless mind. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I found Ethan sitting at the table, his laptop open in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, his expression softening slightly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No," I admitted, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. "You?" he shrugged. "Just working on a project." I nodded, filling my glass at the sink. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I thought about leaving, retreating back to the safety of my bedroom, but something kept me there. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or the way he seemed just as unsure as I was. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned to face him, confused. "For what?" "For that day," he said, his voice hesitant. "I shouldn't have walked in. I should have knocked." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "I should have locked the door. It was just an accident." He nodded, but his expression didn't change. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he closed his laptop and stood up, brushing past me on his way to the stairs. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest. After that night, things started to shift between us. The tension was still there, but it felt different, less awkward, more charged. I noticed the way he lingered in the kitchen when I was cooking. The way his gaze followed me when he thought I wasn't looking. And I couldn't deny the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near. The way my body seemed to react to him without my permission. One afternoon, I was out in the garden, trimming the roses that lined the fence. The sun was warm on my skin, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. But then I heard the back door open, and when I turned, I saw Ethan walking toward me. "Need any help?" he asked, his hands in his pockets. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure. You can grab the clippers." He joined me by the rose bushes, and for a while, we worked in silence, but the air between us was anything but quiet. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, his presence making my heart race. "Vivian," he said softly, breaking the silence. I looked up at him, surprised. He rarely called me by my first name. "Yes?" He hesitated, his gaze intense. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like you're just going through the motions?" The question caught me off guard. Sometimes, I admitted. Why? He shrugged, his eyes searching mine. I don't know. I guess I feel like I'm missing something. Like there's more I should be doing. I didn't know what to say. His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I think we all feel like that sometimes, I said finally. He nodded, but his expression didn't change. I think you deserve more, he said quietly. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The way he was looking at me, like I was the answer to something he couldn't quite put into words, made my heart ache. I wanted to say something, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned back to the roses, pretending I hadn't heard him. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about his words or the way they made me feel. It didn't happen all at once. The shift between us was gradual, like the slow pull of an undertow, invisible until it was too strong to resist. After that afternoon in the garden, I couldn't shake Ethan's words. I think you deserve more. They echoed in my mind, teasing me with their simplicity and the weight behind them. I didn't know what he meant exactly, or maybe I didn't want to admit that I did. From that day forward, the tension between us stopped feeling like an accident. It was deliberate, palpable, as though we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Ethan started finding excuses to spend more time with me. A walk around the neighborhood here, a late-night conversation there. Mark was still away more often than not, and I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew better. One evening, the storm finally broke. It was a quiet night. Rain pattered softly against the windows, and the house felt warmer than usual, the kind of warmth that made everything seem closer, more intimate. I was curled up on the couch with a book, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating the pages. Ethan walked into the room, his hair damp from a shower, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants that hung just a little too low on his hips. Mind if I sit? He asked, gesturing to the other end of the couch. Of course, I said, closing my book and setting it on the coffee table. He sat down, and the cushions shifted beneath his weight, bringing us just a little closer together. For a while we didn't speak. The sound of the rain filled the silence, and I could feel the heat of his body, the way it seemed to radiate across the small space between us. You've been quiet lately, he said after a while. I glanced at him, surprised. I didn't realize you noticed. I notice a lot of things, he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. There it was again, that look. The one that made my stomach twist and my pulse race. I wanted to look away, to break the connection, but I couldn't. His gaze held me there, pinned beneath the weight of everything we weren't saying. Like what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His expression softened, but his eyes didn't waver. Like the way you always hum when you're nervous, or how you tap your fingers against your coffee cup when you're thinking. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. I didn't realize I was so predictable. You're not, he said, his voice steady. Not at all. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. I should have gotten up, should have walked away. But I stayed. You make me feel like I'm going crazy, he said suddenly, his voice raw. I don't know how to stop thinking about you. I froze, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Ethan, I began, but he cut me off. Don't, he said, leaning forward. Don't say it doesn't mean anything, because I know it does. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he closed the distance between us. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands trembling as they found their way to his shoulders. The kiss deepened, the soft rain outside the only sound besides the rush of blood in my ears. It was slow, hesitant, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of where this would lead. But there was no denying the intensity behind it, the way every nerve in my body seemed to come alive beneath his touch. That night was the beginning of everything, and the end of any pretense that we could go back to the way things were. We didn't talk about it the next day. There were no whispered confessions, no promises made. But the tension between us was different now, charged with a new kind of energy. Every glance, every touch, felt like a secret we were sharing. And the more time we spent together, the harder it became to resist the pull. The next time it happened, it wasn't an accident. It was late, and the house was quiet, I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner when Ethan walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway watching me. I could feel his gaze on me, the way it seemed to trace every movement I made. "Ethan," I said softly, turning to face him. "What are you doing?" He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low. "I don't want to stop." My breath caught in my throat as he closed the distance between us. His hands found my waist, pulling me toward him, and I didn't resist. His lips found mine, and all the hesitation from before was gone. This time there was nothing tentative about it. It was hungry, desperate, as though we'd both been holding back for too long. I don't know how long we stayed there, tangled together, in the dim light of the kitchen. All I knew was that I didn't want it to end. From that point on, everything changed. We became careful, deliberate in our stolen moments. A lingering touch as we passed each other in the hallway. A quiet conversation late at night when the rest of the world was asleep. We found ways to be together, even when it felt impossible. One evening, we took a drive out to the edge of town, where the city lights faded into darkness. We parked by the lake, the water reflecting the pale glow of the moon. It was quiet, secluded, the perfect place to be alone. I leaned against the hood of the car, staring out at the water, and felt Ethan's arms wrap around me from behind. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. "It doesn't have to," I whispered, leaning into him. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. We were living on borrowed time, and we both knew it. Every moment we shared felt fragile, like it could shatter at any second. But that only made it harder to let go. As the weeks went on, the line between what was right and what was necessary became harder to see. I found myself lying to Mark more often, inventing excuses to cover my tracks. Ethan did the same, finding ways to keep our secret hidden. But the more we tried to protect what we had, the more I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. One afternoon, as we sat together in the back garden, Ethan reached for my hand. "What happens when this all falls apart?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer him. Because the truth was, I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to let go, not yet. It didn't take long for the cracks to start forming. The excitement of our secret, those stolen moments in the kitchen, late-night drives, whispered confessions had turned into something heavier. The more we gave in to each other, the more impossible it became to maintain the facade. Every day, the walls of my carefully constructed life seemed to shrink, pressing in closer and closer until it felt like I couldn't breathe. The first complication came in the form of Mark. He wasn't a suspicious man by nature, but his frequent absences and our growing emotional distance had left him hyper-aware of changes at home. He started asking more questions. "Where were you last night? Why didn't you answer my call? Did you and Ethan get along okay while I was gone?" Each time he asked, I felt the noose tighten. My responses became shorter, more clipped, as if keeping things vague would somehow protect the truth. But I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me. Not entirely. Then, one evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, he cornered me in the kitchen. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his tone sharp. I kept my hands busy, scrubbing a plate that was already spotless. "Work's been stressful," I lied. "You know how brides can be." He folded his arms, leaning against the counter. "It's not just work. You've been different, Vivian. Distant." I turned to face him, forcing a smile. "Mark, don't be ridiculous. I'm fine." "Are you?" he asked, his voice lowering. "Because it feels like you're hiding something." The weight of his gaze was unbearable. I couldn't meet his eyes, afraid he'd see right through me. Instead, I brushed past him, muttering something about needing to finish the laundry. But as I walked away, I felt his eyes on me, and I knew this wasn't the end of it. The second complication came in the form of Claire. My best friend had always been sharp, her ability to read people both a blessing and a curse. She came over one afternoon, unannounced, catching me off guard. I was in the middle of arranging a bouquet for a client, my hands busy with roses and greenery, when she walked in. "You didn't answer my texts," she said, setting her bag down on the counter. "What's going on?" "Nothing," I replied too quickly. "I've just been busy." She raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. "Busy avoiding me, maybe?" I sighed, setting the bouquet aside. "Claire, I'm fine. Really." You're a terrible liar, you know that? She said, crossing her arms. Come on, spill it. What's going on? Is it Mark? Her question caught me off guard, and for a moment I considered telling her the truth. But the thought of saying it out loud, of admitting what I'd done, was too much. So I shook my head. Mark and I are fine, I said. I've just been in a funk lately, it happens. She studied me for a moment, her expression softening. You know you can talk to me, right? I know, I said, forcing a smile. Thanks, Claire. She didn't press further, but I could tell she didn't believe me. And as much as I hated lying to her, I knew the truth would destroy everything. The third complication came in the form of Ethan himself. As much as we tried to keep things secret, the strain of it all was starting to show. He became restless, his moods shifting unpredictably. One moment he'd be warm and attentive, and the next, he'd pull away, distant and cold. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, the tension finally boiled over. Mark was out of town as usual, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the TV. I was curled up on the couch, a glass of wine in hand, when Ethan walked in. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. I can't keep doing this, he said, his voice low. I set my glass down, my heart sinking. What do you mean? This, he said, gesturing between us. Sneaking around, pretending like nothing's happening. It's killing me. I felt a pang of guilt. Ethan, we don't have a choice. You know that. Don't we? He asked, his voice rising. Why does it always have to be about what's safe? What about what we want? I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Because the truth was, I didn't have an answer. I wanted him, more than I'd ever wanted anything. But the risk, the consequences, it was too much. Ethan, I can't, I began, but he cut me off. Can't or won't, he demanded, his eyes blazing. You're the one who started this, Vivian. You're the one who made me believe this could be something real, and now you're telling me it's too hard? Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them away. I'm trying to protect you, I said quietly. Don't you understand that? He shook his head, his jaw tightening. Maybe I don't want to be protected. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the sound of my own racing heartbeat. The final complication was something neither of us saw coming. It started with a text message, a number I didn't recognize, with a photo attached. My heart stopped when I opened it. It was a picture of Ethan and me, taken during one of our late-night drives. We were parked by the lake, his hand resting on mine, our faces illuminated by the moonlight. It was intimate, unmistakable. The message that followed was short and to the point. We need to talk. Panic set in immediately. I didn't know who had sent it or how they'd found out, but the implications were clear. Someone knew, and they weren't planning to stay silent. I showed the message to Ethan later that night, my hands trembling as I handed him my phone. His face darkened as he read it, and I could see the fear in his eyes. What do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. He set the phone down, his jaw clenched. We find out who sent it, and we stop them. How? I asked. What if they go to Mark, or worse, the police? They won't, he said firmly. Not if we get to them first. His confidence should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The walls we'd built around our secret were crumbling, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The anonymous message haunted me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt into my throat, convinced it would be another threat. But for days there was nothing. No follow-up, no explanation. It was almost worse than if they had continued. The silence left me trapped in my own paranoia, second-guessing everything. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and the tension was starting to bleed into every part of my life. Ethan, on the other hand, was more determined than ever to figure out who was behind it. He was convinced it was someone local, someone who had seen us together and decided to exploit it. He even started skipping his internship to drive around town, looking for cameras near the lake or anyone who might have been watching us. But his frustration grew with every dead end. We can't just sit around waiting for them to make the next move, he said one evening, pacing the living room. If they go to Mark, this is all over. I sat on the couch, clutching a mug of tea I hadn't touched. And what if they already have? I asked quietly. What if he knows? Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face me. He doesn't, he said firmly. If he did, we'd already know. But I wasn't so sure. Mark had been acting strange lately. more distant than usual, his questions sharper, more pointed. I told myself it was just guilt clouding my judgment, but the fear lingered. 2 days later, the next blow landed. I was in the middle of a consultation with a bride-to-be when my phone buzzed on the table. I ignored it at first, focusing on the conversation, but when it buzzed again, then a third time, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to check. The messages were from the same unknown number. The first was another photo, this time of Ethan and me standing too close together in the kitchen, my hand resting lightly on his arm. The second was a simple question. Does your husband know about this? The third message sent a chill down my spine. He will soon. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. My first instinct was to call Ethan, but I knew I couldn't risk it. Not with the bride waiting in the other room. So I forced myself to return to the meeting, smiling and nodding at all the right moments, even as my stomach twisted in knots. The second she left, I called Ethan. We're running out of time, I said as soon as he picked up. What happened? He asked, his voice tense. I told him about the messages, about the threat to tell Mark. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought the call had dropped. But then he spoke. Come over tonight, he said. We need to figure this out. That night, I waited until Mark had gone to bed before slipping out of the house. The drive to Ethan's apartment was short but felt like an eternity, every passing car making my pulse race. By the time I arrived, my hands were trembling. Ethan was waiting for me at the door, his expression grim. I've been doing some digging, he said, leading me inside. I think I know who it is. My heart skipped a beat. Who? He handed me his laptop, and I stared at the screen, my stomach sinking as I read the name, Claire Manning. What? I whispered, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. It makes sense, Ethan said, pacing the room. She's been around enough to notice something was going on, and she's close enough to you to get access to those pictures. No, I said again, my voice trembling. Claire wouldn't do this. She's my friend. Are you sure? He asked, his tone sharp. Because someone's trying to destroy us, and they're not gonna stop. I wanted to argue, to defend her, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. Claire had been acting strange lately, asking more questions, showing up unannounced. Could she have seen something? Could she have decided to use it against me? We have to confront her, Ethan said, breaking into my thoughts. Find out what she wants. No, I said quickly. We can't do that. If she knows, we need to be careful. What if confronting her makes it worse? Then what do you suggest? He asked, his frustration evident. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that this was spiraling out of control, and I was running out of options. The breaking point came the next morning. I woke to the sound of Mark shouting downstairs. My heart sank as I hurried to the living room, finding him standing by the kitchen table, his phone in hand. He looked up when I entered, his face red with anger. Do you want to explain this? He demanded, holding up his phone. I froze. On the screen was one of the photos, the one of Ethan and me by the lake. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing came. Mark, I can explain, I said, my voice shaking. Explain what? He snapped. That you've been sneaking around with my son? That you've been lying to my face for God knows how long? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He threw the phone onto the table, running a hand through his hair. I trusted you, he said quietly. I let you into this family, and this is how you repay me? Tears welled in my eyes as I stepped closer. Mark, please, don't, he said, his voice breaking. Don't say another word. Before I could stop him, he grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, leaving me standing there in the wreckage of everything we'd built. I called Ethan immediately, my hands shaking as I told him what had happened. He was at my door within minutes, his expression grim as he pulled me into his arms. We'll fix this, he said, his voice steady. I promise. But I wasn't sure if we could. The damage was done, and whoever had sent those photos had gotten exactly what they wanted. And as much as I wanted to believe Ethan's words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Mark's absence was a physical weight in the house. His keys weren't on the counter. His favorite shoes were missing from the doorway. Even his cologne, usually faint in the air, seemed to have evaporated. After he stormed out, I spent the next hour sitting on the living room floor, trying to piece together what had just happened. Ethan sat across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. He hadn't spoken much since arriving. There was nothing to say, really. The truth was out. There was no way to undo it. "We should leave," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up at him, startled. "What? Leave? Go somewhere else? Start over?" His eyes were bloodshot, his expression desperate. "There's nothing left for us here, Vivian. He knows." "Ethan, we can't just run away," I said, shaking my head. "What about the business? The house? Your internship? None of that matters anymore," he said firmly, his voice rising. "Don't you see? Whoever did this isn't going to stop. If we stay here, they'll destroy us." I wanted to argue, to tell him that leaving wasn't the answer. But deep down, I knew he was right. Whoever had sent those photos had set this chain of events in motion, and I had no idea what they would do next. Mark knowing the truth was bad enough, but what if it didn't end there? What if they went to the police, or to Ethan's school, or worse, to my clients? Later that night, I finally heard from Mark. A text, short, cold, and to the point. "I need time. Don't call me." The words hit like a slap, but they weren't surprising. I hadn't expected forgiveness. Honestly, I hadn't expected to hear from him at all. But the finality of it, the stark reality that our marriage was hanging by a thread, left me feeling hollow. "What did he say?" Ethan asked, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. I showed him the message, and he nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "That gives us some time." "Time for what?" I asked, exhaustion creeping into my voice. "To figure out who's doing this," he said, "and stop them." The next morning, we decided to confront Claire. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. Every instinct in me screamed that it was a mistake, that dragging her into this mess would only make things worse. But Ethan was convinced she was behind it, and if there was even a chance he was right, we needed answers. I called her and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop on the edge of town. She sounded hesitant at first, but agreed. When I arrived, she was already seated at a small table by the window, stirring a cup of tea. "Vivian," she said, standing to greet me. "What's going on? You sounded off." I forced a smile, sitting across from her. "It's been a rough couple of days." She tilted her head, studying me. "You want to talk about it?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. "Actually, there's something I need to ask you." Her brow furrowed. "Okay." I took a deep breath, the words heavy on my tongue. "Claire, have you noticed anything unusual lately? Anyone watching us?" Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to something harder. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's been sending me photos," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "of me and Ethan. They're threatening to tell Mark." Claire's eyes widened. "What? Vivian, that's insane. Why would anyone do that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I said, watching her closely. "But I need to know if you've seen anything, or if there's something you're not telling me." Her face darkened, and for a moment I thought she might lash out. But then she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I can't believe you'd think I'd do something like that." "I don't want to believe it," I said softly. "But I don't know who else to trust." Claire shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "Vivian, I've been your friend for years. Do you really think I'd betray you like this?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know anything anymore." For a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with things neither of us wanted to say. Finally, Claire stood, grabbing her bag. "If you really think I'm capable of something like this," she said quietly, "then maybe you don't know me at all." And with that, she walked away, leaving me sitting alone, my coffee untouched. When I got back to the house, Ethan was waiting for me. He was pacing the living room, his expression tense. "What did she say?" he asked. "She denied it," I said, sinking into the couch. She was furious. "Of course she denied it," he said, his voice sharp. "Doesn't mean she's innocent." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But the thought of Claire, my best friend, being behind this felt too surreal to accept. That night, everything came to a head. I was sitting in the bedroom staring at my phone when the next message arrived. This time, there was no photo, just a single sentence. "Your husband deserves to know everything." My heart sank. Whoever was behind this wasn't bluffing. They were going to tell Mark, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I showed the message to Ethan, my hands trembling as I handed him the phone. He read it quickly, his expression hardening. We have to leave, he said again, his voice firm. Tonight. Ethan, Vivian, listen to me, he said, grabbing my hands. They're not going to stop. If we stay here, this is going to destroy both of us. I stared at him, my mind racing. He was right. Whoever was doing this had already taken everything from me. My marriage, my stability, my sense of control. If we stayed, they'd take more. Okay, I said finally, my voice shaking. Let's go. We packed quickly, grabbing only the essentials. I left a note for Mark, though I wasn't sure what to say. In the end, I kept it simple. I'm sorry. We drove through the night, leaving behind the house, the town, the life we'd built. It felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's story. I didn't know where we were going, or what the future held. All I knew was that I couldn't look back. The next morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Ethan reached over and took my hand. We'll figure this out, he said softly. Together. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I believed him. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions I wasn't ready to face. But for now, we had each other. And that, I told myself, was enough.